past, in terms of how it's presented, in terms of how people interpret the past. And here's a good example of an ethical situation that was related to me by a professor at my PhD granting institution, Binghamton University up in New York State. And my first class I took at Binghamton was with her, and it was an anthropological ethics course. And she related to us a story the very first day of class about a mistake that she had made in anthropology. And so when she was working on her master's degree through Berkeley, she had gone to Ghana in Africa, and she had lived with a village of people, and she had done excavations just outside the village, but it was the chief and his family that put her up for the months that she was there, and her workforce was that village of people. And so they helped her with their excavations. And she lived with the chief and his family for several months. And towards the end, she realized that she was going to have a few $1,000s of grant money left over, and she wanted to give something back to the community as a thank you for housing her and helping her complete her research. And she'd been talking to the chief for months, and she had written down a lot of notes about the royal family and the lineage that's won chieftaincy. And she said, okay, hey, how about I make a family tree, the chief's family, going back generation before generation. It's like a genealogy book. And I make copies of it, and I give it out to the entire village. And the chief's like, that's excellent, do that. Everyone's going to appreciate it. And so she does this. She makes basically a genealogy of the chief's family. And she makes copies of it. She has it bound. She has 100 copies. And she shows it to the chief the night before she's going to leave. And she says, hey, here's the book. Here's what I'm going to give out tomorrow before I fly back to the States. And he looks at it and says, oh, this is great. And he's flipping through it. And he says, oh, but there's a few mistakes. She's like, whoa, what do you mean? I thought I took good notes. And he says, yeah, but there's a few names in here that I don't want to recognize. And it turns out that generations before, there was two brothers vying for control over the community. And over the successive generations, the chieftaincy for the group either fell on one side of the family, one brother's family, or the other. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to black out the names of the other side of the family, the other brother's family, when that side of the family held political control over the community. And so she's like, oh, what do I do? I already made 100 copies of this, and he wants me to black out 8 names in each book. Do I just throw them away? That's going to piss him off, and I'll lose my connection here. So she thought to herself in the field that night, okay, what harm can come? And so they stay up that night with markers, and they black out those names. She gets back to the States, and a few weeks later she learns that there's violence in the community between those two political factions, and several people are killed. And so she thinks to herself, I did this. This is something that I directly contributed to. She didn't quit anthropology. She was not ostracized from the scientific community, but she said that was a huge mistake. It's because people are tied to the past, to history. And so whenever you do archaeology, you have to think through all the ethical ramifications. And y'all are in the honors department, so many of you have probably gone through the human subjects research review committee here. Have y'all done that? Okay, so how many of y'all have had to write a human subjects CV where you talk to fellow students? You have, right? Okay. Every college and university across the United States has a human subjects research review committee, which is a panel of administrators and professors that'll read through your entire research design and it'll help you think through the process of, can anyone get hurt if you conduct this research? If you're using living people, human subjects, do you protect their anonymity? You're not going to list their name and their address in your report. You might use a pseudonym for them, things like that. They help you think through that process. And I'm really kind of the reason why this exists at Lone Star. Long before Lone Star was called Lone Star, back when we were North Harris Community College District, about 20 years ago, I had an honors student do an ethnography project, and I had him go through the process of getting signed consent from all his informants. And this is before we actually had human subjects here. And And at the end of his presentation, the dean said, hey, we need to do that. Y'all didn't have to do it because we don't have it formally here at the college, but we really need to implement this. And so I was like, yeah, that's a great idea. Y'all should, because you have a lot of honors level students doing research with human subjects. And back then I thought it was a good idea. Now, every time I have a student who says, and I'm going to talk to people, like, no, you realize how much extra effort it takes to get through this thing through human subjects. But it's important to do that because you don't want to risk hurting people. And even though archaeology is about the abstract, distant past, people are still tied to interpretation of the past. And there's other types of ethical considerations too. So before you begin your research, whatever institution you're at, Lone Star College, U of H, Binghamton University, you have a panel of administrators, professors, look through your research design and help you think through, okay, how are you going to do this where you don't hurt people? I had to do this for my dissertation, and my dissertation was about cemeteries. I was also going to talk to people, so I went through human subjects. And I had to revise my research design 3 times before they said, okay, you're good to go with your research. So this is the first phase, is just coming up with the idea and a sketch outline about what you want to do. Your research question, then you do your lit review. That usually takes you 6 months to a year to get through that stage of your research. Depends on how fast of a reader you are and how many times you have to tell your committee, yeah, I'm ready to start my research, and them saying, no, you better read these 2 books as well. You think through what original research questions you're bringing to bear to that culture and time period you want to study. If it's historical archaeology, you use historical documents to help you flesh out your research design and ask the best questions. You think through, okay, how do I get funding to do this? And is it safe to do this? Does anyone get hurt on this research? The second step of our research design fun part is your field methods. This is where you go out and you collect your information. Okay. And there's a bunch of different field methods you can employ, but there's 2 basic categories. There's non-intrusive and intrusive. And you always try to use non-intrusive field methods first before you start digging, because that can tell you the best place to dig. You can't dig up an entire site. You don't have time, you don't have the money for it. And so you want to be judicious with the use of your digging time. You can't dig 3,000 test pits. You might only have time to dig a dozen. You want to place those in the best locations where you think there's going to be artifacts that answer your research questions. And so you'll use non-intrusive methods before you start digging. The very first thing you do when you get out to an archaeological site is you do a surface survey, which is also known as a pedestrian survey. And that's literally where you just walk across the ground surface of the site. You study the shape of the ground. If we remember back from that lecture about New Orleans and how I found those 2 soaking tanks, those soaking tanks were about ½ an inch deep depressions in the ground. That's what they looked like on the surface 150 years after they got filled up. And so I was walking through actually what was someone's backyard at the time, and I saw those little divots in the ground. I thought to myself, well, those could be anything. That could be from a cement pad from 10 years ago. But there's 2 of them, and they're arranged close together, and they're oddly positioned in a backyard. I was thinking, well, maybe this is from something older, because these houses have been here for 100 years. Before that, it was the cooperage. And so maybe these 2 divots in the ground are to something else. And so it was based on this slight topographical difference in the ground. That's how I knew to dig there. And I knew that from doing the surface survey. Sometimes you're walking across a huge pasture and you see not a sink in the ground, but a mound. That mound could be the result of Native American occupation. And so you look for both sinkholes in the ground, but also the soil being mounded up. I remember one project in northeast Texas, near the Arkansas border, where we were doing a state park, and we were looking in particular at what's called micro mounds, little maybe 4-foot diameter mounds of soil that are only about 3 feet high. And it's those micro mounds that are camp spots, maybe for a fireplace hearth or a fire pit, maybe for a stone tool production zone of prehistoric Hedonian Indian activity. And we have found hundreds of them out there. Unfortunately, almost all of them had already had an irregularly shaped pit dug straight through the center of them. It wasn't done by archaeologists, it was done by looters. People unscientifically digging up the artifacts, not for scientific knowledge, not to preserve the past, but to sell stuff on eBay and Amazon. So that they know about differential topography as well. Now, if you're using or going for a site where the people, the culture had developed metallurgy, meaning they knew how to work metals, you might use a metal detector to tell you the best place to dig. You do this almost always on Civil War battlefield sites, because whenever you have a battle in the Civil War, you have shot coming out of the rifle, you have a cartridge being ejected, there's metal components to that, and so metal detectors are really good in Civil War battlefield sites at telling you where to dig. And in terms of your overall budget, a good metal detector maybe runs you $1,200 and it's reusable. Ground penetrating radar has become one of my favorite things to use in archaeology. About 3 years ago, the geography professor and I wrote a grant for about $80,000 of drones and cameras. We have a fleet of drones here for aerial mapping. But we had written the grant and then bought the stuff 6 months later. 6 months later, all these expensive electronics had dropped in price, and so we were left with like $12,000. Like, Dave, what else do you want to get? Like, okay, well, let me shop around for a ground penetrating radar unit. Usually around about $40,000 or $50,000. But I managed to find this one retired NASA scientist who made them one at a time in his garage and sold them one at a time. And so I got one for $5 grand. And so we actually have a really nice ground penetrating radar unit that has a laptop attached to it. And it doesn't show you a picture perfect image of what's in the ground, but what it shows you is like a cross section of the ground and wavelengths of density. So if there's a huge something in the ground that's more solid than the surrounding soil, you might get a little blurble in the scan at that depth. It just tells you that something's in the ground. It shows you its approximate size, and it shows you approximately how dense it is. Daniel and Claire here had the opportunity last spring to work with me with the ground penetrating radar unit at the Bottom Cemetery, which is really close to this camp. It's about half an hour away. But typically, this costs you $30,000. If you lease one, it's $1,000 a day. It's really expensive in terms of your budget. Sometimes people use electrical resistivity instead, because that's also known as the poor man's ground penetrating radar. So what is electrical resistivity? Well, the idea of it is actually really simplistic. It's two archaeologists in an open field, and one of them has a cart with a car battery on it, and you have a metal prong that goes in the ground, and you run an electrical charge through the ground. Okay. This archaeologist over here has an electrical resistivity meter, a nanometer, that basically measures electrical current, and he has, or she has, a prong that goes in the ground too. And so what you do is you send electricity through the ground, and this person over here reads the strength of the electrical current. The idea is that if there's something dense in the ground, it's going to inhibit the flow of the current, and so the value, when it reaches this prong over here, is less. And so if you do this in a grid across an entire field, where you do it here, and then both of you walk over here, and then you do it across the other axis of the grid, and you get numbers on each of these lines, you look for those areas where the numbers drop down, you see where they intersect in the field, and that tells you there's something there that's inhibiting the flow of current. And it doesn't really show you how deep in the ground it is. It doesn't show you how big it is beyond just the size of your grid, but it shows you approximately where something is in the ground that's dense. It might be a fireplace hearth, it might be remains of a foundation to a building, or it might be something else. If the flow is actually stronger, there might be a cave or something that's filled with water, allowing more current flow. This setup is only about $300, so it's cheap and it's reusable. Ground penetrating radar, $30,000. So again, it ties directly into your budget. Now, the number one thing I've used to do surveys over a large area when I want to pinpoint places I want to dig in is aerial photography. We have fantastic aerial photographs all across the United States, especially after World War I and World War II for defense purposes. We have access to all those photos now. And aerial photography can be really good at showing you where buried objects are. And the reason why is whenever you have something in the ground that's really dense, and say here's the ground surface, and you have plants growing all across the ground surface, but the roots want to go down this far, and something fixed in the ground right here, the roots can't grow down as far. And at the ground level, you can't tell this, but up in the sky looking down, what you'll see is a patch of vegetation which is less well grown, it's less lush, or maybe a different color. And so it shows up like a sore thumb from a perspective of being a few hundred feet up in the air. This is the number one way that Roman sites are discovered in Europe. What they'll do is they'll look at photographs of farmers' fields, and what they'll see is a dotted line or a line of vegetation running through the field that is less lush. It's perhaps a different shade of green, whatever agricultural produce this is. And the reason why you have a line of vegetation which is less well grown is because there's an old Roman road there, and the roots of the plants can't grow as deep. So aerial photographs can be really good at showing you where sites are. I can look at any aerial photograph across Harris County and know where historic fences were based on vegetation patterns. They're also really good for identifying areas that used to be cemeteries. Now, sometimes thermal imaging can be revealing as well. We learned about that in one of those D2L lectures as well. That's a special camera that looks at differential heat signatures of the ground. And the idea here is that during the heat of the day, the sun's solar radiation bakes the ground hot, and in the evening, when it's cooling off, or in the morning, different densities of objects would bleed off the heat at different rates. And so if you have something in the ground, even if it's a few inches beneath the ground surface, it's going to be hotter than the surrounding soil, and as it radiates out the heat, it'll glow red or hotter than the surrounding area. And so you can use a thermal camera along with aerial photography to detect sites. Now, most thermal cameras today are about $10,000. I'm so surprised that the geographer and I managed to convince Lone Star College to buy one. The thing's only about maybe this big, and it only weighs 2 ounces, but it's $10,000 electronics packed into that. We haven't crashed that drone yet, so we still have that camera. We have lost a few drones though. And it's really good at determining the location of subsurface objects in certain cases. You can't do it in all types of soils. You can't do it if there's too much vegetation on the surface. But otherwise, you can use it for looking just a few inches to the ground if there's something really dense in the ground that has a differential heat signature. Another thing you can do is look at satellite imaging. If you're looking at an entire region, a larger area, the same thing, this idea of different patterns in the soil show you where large settlements are. This one researcher, I forget her name, has studied the northeast coast between the United States and Canada, and has found dozens of Viking sites by looking at satellite images. another really good example of how satellite imaging has been used was the discovery of the ancient city of Ubar in the country of Oman. For the longest time, people knew that this city was referred to in historical texts and religious texts, but no one's ever found it. It remains this ancient city. And this one researcher in Los Angeles realized, hey, why don't we just use a satellite and look at the thermal spectra of the satellite images at night over Oman and look for crisscrosses of different colors converging in the desert, because those would be the camel trails and the roads. And if we find a crisscrossing and intersection of these lines, but we don't know about any city being there, maybe that's the city of Ubar. And they did this, and certainly enough, that's how they discovered the remains of the ancient city of Ubar, by using the thermal signature of satellite images. If what you're going for, again, is within historical archaeology, within the time period of written records, you can also just do archival research. Like that one case in New Orleans when we were looking at that one well attached to that building, the house that had the watercolor front to it, the front of the household along with the sandboard maps. That was a nice intersection of archival research. And if what you're looking for is a relatively recent past, you can also just talk to people. So when I first started that dig in Houston, in Freedmanstown, we talked to the granddaughter of Rutherford Yates, Olie Yates McCulloch. She came out to the site, and she was in her 60s or 70s. Actually, she was in her 70s at that point. She's passed now. And of course, back then, I knew about privies, and I wanted to find the privy to the Yates property. And I asked her, hey, do you remember where the outhouse was to this house? She said, oh yeah, I do. She kind of gestures in the corner of the yard. She goes over there. I'm like, okay, great. So I dug there for quite a while. I did not find a privy. I didn't know at that point the difference between a proper privy and what's known as a drylander. It turns out that all across Houston, most of the privies were something else. So typically, a privy is a hole in the ground, and you have a board across the top of the hole. You have a chair or something and a shed sitting on top of it. That's your typical outhouse, right? In Houston, you didn't have the hole in the ground. What you had was a bucket under the chair, and once a week, a wagon would come by, and you dump your effluents in the wagon, and that type of privy is called a drylander. They did it for hygiene purposes in the 1800s. Most of Houston used the drylanders, and so we don't have these convenient pits in the ground in properties all across Houston. I only just discovered this a few years ago, so you don't have those same types of buried pits and features. But once you exhaust all of your non-intrusive methods, that's when you switch over to using your intrusive methods. Now usually in archaeology, your data is underground. Why? Because of soil buildup over time. You don't always have artifacts getting successfully buried underground. It depends on the area of the world you're in. For example, when I was doing my research in California, I worked as a civilian contractor with the U.S. Navy on an inland naval base. The desert I was in was really flat. And you had mountains and hills off in the distance, but you didn't have a lot of erosion off the mountains and hills. And erosion, as well as flooding from rivers and nearby water sources, is the #1 way that things end up deeper underground. When you're in a really flat area that doesn't have a lot of wind, erosion from rain, you might have something drop on the ground surface, and it's still poked through the ground surface 10,000 years later. This is actually an example from when I was in California. The first week I was there, we discovered the tip to a Clovis spear tip, spear point. Clovis spear points are about this long, looks like a lance tip. They're really rare. Well, that Clovis point was partially poking through the sand, even though the thing's 10,000 plus years old. It's one of the first types of tools people used when they came across the Bering Land Bridge connection into the New World is they had Clovis spears. And we found one just sitting there in the desert. That's because it's so flat and you don't have a lot of runoff from the hills and mountains. However, if you're in an area like I was up in New York State, at my PhD institution, Binghamton University, and you have mountains and hills in a valley, you get a lot of erosion off the sides of those hills, those mountains. And so you get a lot of soil buildup over time. And something dropped from the ground surface 10,000 years ago might be 10 feet underground, underneath all those erosional things. And so it really depends on the area of the world you're at. There's something on the ground surface or deeper underground. It depends on the site formation processes. So most of the digs I've done have involved excavation because there's going to be at least some erosion where the objects you want to get to are deeper underground. And there's a basic geological concept we have to know at this point. It's called the law of superposition. It's kind of a duh concept to us today, but over 100 years ago when this one geologist thought to himself, hey, soil builds up one layer at a time, and the stuff closer to the surface we're walking on is younger, the stuff deeper down is older. That's the law of superposition. It's an important thing to note in archaeology, that again, the deeper down you go, the older stuff's going to be. And how far down relates to a particular time period depends on the rate at which soils build up in a particular region. It's not going to be the same all the way across the planet. You'll have some areas where you have quick soil build up because it's right off the side of the hill. You have all this rain erosion of soils off the hill. Other areas where it's just wind-blown soils, you might only have inches built up over thousands of years. So again, here's the ground surface of grass. Here's clay and bedrock. In between there, you're going to have younger stuff or more recent stuff and stuff that goes further back in time. And so in most locations, you want to do an archaeological project at, your stuff, your data, your broken bits of yesterday will be a few inches underground or maybe even 10 feet underground, depending on the rate at which soil is built up. And that's when you switch over to using intrusive methods to get the data in the form of artifacts that allow you to answer your problem orientation, your research questions. You want to figure out something about the past. Okay, and there's a range of different ways that archaeologists dig. Some are slow, and some are quick. The quick ones, however, are the least scientific. And in the United States, there's something that was developed in the 1970s called shovel testing, or shovel test pits. And this is the crudest form of archaeology. Basically, a shovel test pit is where you have a shovel, and you're standing on the ground surface. You dig a hole about this wide, maybe 1.5 to 2 feet wide, and you dig it down as far as you can go, which is typically the length of the shovel. So you get down about 3.5 feet. And as you pull out the soil, you have somebody nearby with a screen, one of those wire mesh screens. You dump the soil over the screen. The person there is pushing the soil through the screen and finding artifacts, or maybe not. And that's how you dig. And it only takes you maybe 15 to 20 minutes to dig a shovel test pit, which is quick. And so it doesn't eat up much of your budget in terms of person hours in the field. But it is definitely not precise. Every time the shovel goes in the ground, you risk breaking an artifact. Shovels aren't the most precise tool. And every time the shovel goes in the ground, you risk knocking loose an artifact from the wall of the shovel test, where it might fall in deeper. It'll confuse you in terms of analyzing how old the artifact is, but you don't know exactly how deep it came from in the ground. And so it's not used to analyze an entire site. People use the shovel test method to look for the presence or absence of artifacts. And if you find a cluster of artifacts in the ground, you you say, hey, that's worth investigating further, that's when you switch over to test units. Test units is part of what you've seen on TV in terms of documentaries. A test unit is an area that's usually 5 by 5 feet. It's strung off, and you have archaeologists kneeling by the test unit, digging it more slowly with more precise tools. The more precise tools comes in the form of a small hand shovel known as a trowel. So a trowel is the same thing that bricklayers use to lay out mortar for bricks. It's about this big. It's a small hand shovel with a triangular blade. And when you scrape that across the ground surface, it's different from digging with a shovel, right? You're not breaking artifacts, you're discovering them intact, and you're getting a lot better data because you can actually map in how deep they are and where in your test unit you're finding them. So this is a standard method in archaeology in terms of discovering the past, is by doing hand-excavated test units. Now this could take you 2 weeks to dig, one test unit 5 by 5 feet, whereas a shovel test takes you 15 to 20 minutes. So there's a difference in the amount of person hours that goes into it and your budget. And the reason why shovel test was invented back in the 1970s is because there was lots of cultural resource management taking place, where there's pipelines being built for the energy sector. And the pipelines were using federal money, subsidized by the government, to go in place, or they were crossing across public lands, so you had to do archaeology. But the length of the pipeline might have been 300 miles. There wasn't enough time for archaeologists to go in and dig test units along that entire 300 miles. So instead, they said, okay, let's come up with a compromised type of archaeological excavation where instead of getting precise data, we just know if there's stuff in the ground. And if it looks like it's significant enough, then we'll go back in later on and do test units. So that's why shovel tests were invented. They're not the primary method of analyzing a site, the primary method for knowing if a site's there. Now, you might be in a certain situation where you know there's going to be layer after layer of soils in the ground that do not relate to the time period that answers your research question. And this is the case in New Orleans. I worked on another project where we had the St. Louis Cemetery. Has anyone been to the St. Louis cemeteries in New Orleans? Okay. Those cemeteries with those fantastic above-ground crypts and mausoleums. And an apartment complex was around the edge of the St. Louis Cemetery, digging down. So they hired Earth Search. This is towards the end of me doing that MCONO project. And everywhere we dug, in between these apartment complexes, in the green spaces between the apartments, about 6 feet deep, we found human remains. It was fantastic. Well, at least for me it was. For the developers it was awful. But we actually had the apartments were still being lived in. And so at 3 in the afternoon, kids would come home from school. They'd run up to the sides of our trenches. And I'd be down there saying, yeah, here's a human bone, here's a human skull. These 8-year-olds were like, yeah, that's awesome. But then the parents come home around 5 or 6. We worked the entire day. And I'd say, yeah, look, there's a grave right here. And I'd be standing outside someone's window. They're like, yeah, my bed's right there. And so there's people on the ground underneath where I sleep, like, yeah. They did not like that. But the reason why we had a backhoe, an earth moving machine, help out with this dig is because New Orleans has been developed for so long that there was 5 feet of urban buildup from the 1900s all the way up until recent. And the layer of soil that had the graves in them was 6 to 7 feet deep. And we simply didn't have the time to use the test unit method of going down that far through history. That it is important, but didn't answer a research question. The research question was, how far did the border of the St. Louis Cemetery used to extend, and how many graves are underneath this housing complex? And so we couldn't answer those questions in this length of time we had. We had about 3 months. We had to come up with a means for knowing exactly where the footprint of the cemetery used to be. And so we had a backhoe scrape away 5 feet in a long trench, and once it got down to about 5 feet, we hopped in there with trowels and shovels, and we dug the rest of the way. And so we only had to dig through maybe this much soil before we start coming up with coffins, before we start coming up with human remains. And we ended up finding not only the extent of the cemetery, we poked in about this far into the apartment complex, but we actually managed to find about 6 feet down the ground the remains of wooden posts sticking upright in the soil. That was actually the old fence line to that cemetery too, a cemetery that goes back 200 years. So that was really cool to find the fence lines. We could actually tell them with no doubt, this is how much that cemetery used to poke in over here. And then we're at this final meeting where we're presenting them this information, and the developer said, well, you know, we want to renovate that ground. How much is it going to cost to dig out all those graves? And so the owner of the company looks at me and says, Dave, how much is that going to cost? And I do really quick mental math, and I write down a number on a sheet of paper. I think I came up with $5 million. I plunked it over to her, and she looks at it, she's like, wow. She wasn't going to tell the developers $5 million. She's like, no way, that's stupid. And she tells them, oh, about $1 million. I was like, you know, lowballing my estimate, right? And the developer's like, no way, we can't do that. They asked me, you know, what else can we do with the land? I said, well, you know, you need parkland down here. Just make this entire space a green space. They're like, no, we can't do that. I was like, well, I don't know what to tell you. So we left that meeting, and Joe's like, well, we can't tell the developers $5 million. They'll never buy it. Because she said, what you do is you tell them a low number, and then after a while, you tack stuff onto it. Like, oh, okay. So she had more business acumen in Anthropology than I did. But what did they end up doing with this? I looked recently on Google Earth. They turned it into park space anyways, but they couldn't do anything else with it. So it's park space, about 6 feet underground. There's hundreds of individuals. They're about 100 to 200-year-olds from New Orleans. But that's an example of using backhoes in archaeology. I wouldn't use them on too many different types of digs, only on very special cases where I have to get through 5 feet of history, 100 years worth in a hurry to answer a more pressing research question. You're doing a compromise, you're doing a sacrifice. You're saying this history is more important than this other history, but it is a matter of thinking to yourself in terms of utilitarian ethics. Does answering these questions weigh out the fact that we're flying through this much history over here? You have to apply that ethically on a case-by-case basis, and that's part of the ethics of archaeology. Okay, you can also use soil probes, which is intrusive, but it's minimally intrusive. And a soil probe is basically a pipe. And the iron pipe is maybe this wide, and it has a little window cut into the side of it. So here you have a pipe, it has a slot down the side of it, and it has a handle, a T-bar handle. And what you do is you push this thing into the ground, you twist it, and you pull it back up. And the soil, just like in a straw, you poke into a milkshake, gets caught up in the center of this tube. And you look at that soil through this little window, you use the tip of your trowel, and you pull out soil, and that gives you an idea of the different types of soil, at least for the length of that tube. And sometimes small artifacts get caught up in that tube as well. And so it's intrusive, but it's minimally intrusive because you only disturb an area of the width of the pipe. And it gives you this quick snapshot of what's in the ground. And these things you can get off of environmental sites. They're only like $100 each. Now all of this and how much data you get ties into your sampling strategy. How much of a site are you going to dig up? Archaeologists usually try not to dig up more than 10% of a site. They try to leave 90% of the site untouched. Why do you think that's true? Why don't they want to always dig up an entire site?
For future archaeologists?
Yeah, for future archaeologists, exactly. You can adequately address your research questions usually by only digging a portion of the site. You don't have to dig up the entire site. Because archaeologists know that 100 years from now, there's going to be better research methods. There's going to be better technology for analyzing artifacts. So you always try to leave part of the site behind for a future archaeologist. In the case of New Orleans, the MCLNO project, I knew that they're planning on building multi-floor buildings on every city block. and that the foundations of these buildings was going to wipe away everything in the ground. And so in that particular case, I went for 100% remediation. I was going for every possible site and every possible artifact I could get within the scope of our budget. And that's why we ended up with 1.8 million artifacts. A lot of people criticized me for saying you dug up too much. And I was like, no. I was tasked with finding the cultural resources that were there within a certain span of time and a certain budget. And so I dug up everything I could because I knew that stuff's going to get destroyed and that there might be different research questions researchers wanted to ask in the future about the past. But unfortunately, what I ended up doing is I dug up so many artifacts that the estate warehouse where they store artifacts couldn't accept them all because they didn't have space. And so we actually had to come up with a special culling method, meaning they only received or accepted a certain percentage of that amount of artifacts. But still, we were able to save the most important artifacts from the site instead of just sending in a subsample that might not address as many research questions. So this is not an exhaustive list of non-intrusive and intrusive methods. It's just some of them. We'll be adding on to this as the semester progresses. So here is an example of a test unit. And again, it's an area that's sprung off. So you have a nail in the ground on all four corners. And in this particular case, it's subdivided into four sections. And the reason why archaeologists would typically subdivide the test unit is you want to not only control for recording how deep artifacts are as you dig down, because the deeper down you go, the further back in time it is usually, but you also want to be able to control for artifact patterns across space. For example, if we had a blacksmith shop over here, and you have a lot of ash and debris from the blacksmith shop and slag spilling out from the workshop, you might get a pattern of ash and slag over here, but not so much over here. And so by digging a unit and subunits, you can quantify and control for artifacts across space. That's important. That allows you to create a narrative about past human behavior within a particular time frame. And then recording how deep things are allows you to talk about change over time, because the deeper down you go, the further back in time it is. So that's why we have this subdivided off into these subunits. This is actually right off the back porch of the Rutherford Yates house, the one that's currently a museum in Freedmanstown. So this is the very first test unit we dug out there back in 2000 or 2003. And my research question here is that I knew that for a while, Rutherford Yates operated his printing press off his back porch of his house. And so it was a printing press from the 19-teens and early 1920s. And I wanted to know if there's material byproducts from the operation of an antique printing press that could show up in the soil. And the answer is yes. As a matter of fact, back then, you had these little squares called typeface that are about the thickness of the tip of a pencil. And on top of each of the squares, you had a letter, like a typeset letter. And what you do is you take all this typeset, you put it together in a frame, you spell out paragraphs that way, you rub ink across the top of it, press one sheet of paper at a time across that, that's the operation of the printing press. And so those little squares were the byproduct of the operation of that type of printing press from 100-ish years ago. Okay, the third step in research design. The first step, of course, is problem orientation. Problem orientation is where you come up with a research question. You think through ethics. If anyone you're hurt by doing your research, you do it in such a way that no one gets hurt. And you also think through who's going to give you money to do your research. The second step, which in my opinion is usually the most entertaining, is your field methods. That's where you go out and you search for your stuff. It's the adventure of archaeology. either looking at the ground surface, or in some cases digging down into the ground usually. And then after you dig up all your artifacts, hopefully will address your research questions. What do you do then? Well, you take all those artifacts back to your lab, and you analyze the artifacts. That's the lab phase of the research design. Now, typically, you try, or you should, save 2/3 of your budget for this phase onwards of your research. You try to only spend 1/3 of your budget collecting your data. You save the lion's share of your budget for the lab phase. And the reason why is for every hour you spend in the field digging up artifacts, typically it takes 3 hours in the lab to analyze them. It takes more time in the lab. Because not only do you say what the artifact is and how far back in time it goes, you also try to stabilize the artifact. You try to preserve it for future generations using specialized lab techniques. So, at this point, the very first step is a triage system of looking at the artifact and saying to yourself, is this artifact stable? Is it going to decay on me? If you think it's going to decay because you dug it out of the ground, now you have it in a completely different environment, an air-conditioned building, you try to stabilize the artifact. There's various chemical processes for giving a longer shelf life to different artifacts. We'll talk about those in a little bit. But then also, because it came out of the ground, it has dirt stuck to it. And so in order to tell what it is, you clean the artifact. Like our artifact cleaner in New Orleans, his name is Aurelius, says, I'm doing the dishes of New Orleans from 100 years ago, is the way he expressed it. And that's basically what he's doing. He's cleaning lots of bottles, plates, and saucers, artifacts like that. But then after you have the artifacts cleaned, you catalog the artifacts. And that's where you have people sitting at tables like you are now, with trays of artifacts sitting in front of you, and you look at these tiny fragments. Usually it's not an entire artifact, this is a portion of the artifact because the thing's been in the ground, it's been broken apart. And you look at it and you try to say, okay, this is part of a plate, this is part of a saucer, and based on the designs of the artifact, you know how far back in time it goes, which is one of my areas of specialty in determining the time depth of archaeology is American material culture from the 1800s. So this is part of a bowl. It's a pretty thick piece of ceramic. And this is part of a plate. But I know that this finds its mean of production in the 1850s. It's called whiteware. And this ironstone is produced later in time, about 30 years later. It finds its mean of production in the 1880s. And you're like, okay, how do you know the difference between the two? Well, they have different densities, Mohs hardness scale, and you just get a practiced eye for identifying artifacts over time. Other people are really good with the human skeleton, so osteology. Other people are really good with arrowheads, with lithics. My main thing in archaeology is stuff from the 1800s, because I've been on a lot of historical archaeological sites across the United States. However, there are other people that specialize in pre-human artifacts from, say, 1.9 million years ago. Again, this is a plaster cast, it's not the original thing. But this is an Herculean hand axe, the hand axe I talked about in that one lecture. Again, it's a scientific grade hand axe down to a millimeter in accuracy, so it's a research grade. But this is called the Swiss Army rock of human evolution, because Homo erectus, when they developed this is a tool they carried with them when they left Africa. You use the butt of it for smashing things, use the side of it as a knife, or after you chase an animal in the midday heat for 3 hours, you run to the side of it and you stab it like a dagger. It's a multi-purpose tool. There's some people that specialize just in the Herculean tool set of 1.9 million years ago. You can't be a specialist in everything, but you can be a specialist in a few different areas. Okay, so part of this process is you try to stabilize artifacts. And when I was hired on with EarthSearch in New Orleans, I was originally hired on as the lab director, and I'd be the archaeologist that was also in control of the MCONO project. It turns out I was pretty much tasked with 20 different projects along those 5 years and running the lab. And so I get into this lab, which is a giant warehouse, and I was told, okay, you're in charge of curating and managing all these artifacts. And I go down to the basement where there's all these boxes of things. I'm looking through the boxes that say metal nails on them from like the 1820s. I open them up, and I look inside, there's this bags of rust. I'm like, okay, these were nails at one point in time. Because they sat in here for 7 years, they've all rusted. They haven't been processed. There's a way of stabilizing ferrous metal objects that are old, that are rusting. It's called electrolysis. And we'll learn a little bit more about electrolysis in just a second. But that stabilizes metal artifacts. Then there's various ways of assigning time to different substances, different types of artifacts. What's the type of scientific dating technique you can use for living organisms that have died and passed? How do you know when they died? What's the thing that dates bone and plant remains? Carbon dating, very good. Okay, radiocarbon dating. But there's different things for different substances, including things like cooling in hand axes or volcanic glass obsidian. We'll learn about those next time. We're almost running out of time. So we've got a minute left. There's also this point that you do soil analysis. So whenever you dig a test unit, you save aside 1 bucket for every level of soil you go down. And what you do is you treat that bucket of soil differently than the rest of the soil because you're looking for artifacts that might be smaller than the screen that you use to screen artifacts in the field, looking for artifacts. What you would do with this other bucket of soil is you run it through something a lot more like window mesh, a much smaller square. That allows you to save aside seed pods and pollen that you might send to an ethnobotanist to do plant analysis. And we'll pick up here next time in terms of looking at research design archaeology and talking about lab methods. Next time we're going to pick up here and address all the different ways for assigning time to artifacts. So now we have, I'm going to save aside 10 minutes at the end of class